This is going to be a presentation about Lineage's data. If that's not obvious, I'm just going to become very quickly what that means. Everyone knows Lineage and Provenance and has had to deal with that in their decision support work. And if a lot of folks probably have done data vault, and so you've done some type of Lineage already. And this is just really an extension of that. So I'm going to, this was a much longer presentation. I'm going to try to go through very quickly. I know my accent is a little different, so I will try to remember to speak clearly and slowly, but I'm going to get through and get some audience participation, and I'll mention why, because this is really just, I want to present an idea, and then how it gets implemented is really up to you. And I want to emphasize that, but I am going to show you a particular type of implementation. So the why, there are many reasons for why, if any of you have been asked in your organizations to implement or purchase a Lineage product, there are a lot of the reasons for this. Most of the time, the simple reason is if I'm looking at data in a report, where did that come from? Where did it originate? What transformations have taken place, et cetera? And that's generally what is meant. I didn't paste in here. I think originally this presentation had a definition from somewhere. I'm not going to do that because I think it's sufficient to keep it simple. Now, how it's going to be implemented, I don't know how it is in Europe, but in the United States, it seems more often than not, people will go after buying a product, and there are many, and they're all very good. And I'm not putting those products down. I'm just wanting to make an argument that building this into your data warehousing decision support processes, it might be much easier than you have thought. And I think if you're going to consider doing purchasing something, to at least take a look at it, and I'll speak to that a little more as we go on. Now, if you have the skills necessary in-house to build a data warehouse, and you're not farming that out, and you have the skills necessarily to create your business intelligence or reporting environment or any activities that are going to go on around or depend upon your data warehouse, then you already have the skills to do what I'm going to describe in-house, because that's all you need. Let's take, for example, if you're building on Oracle and you're using Cognos, you only need those skills to build Lineage in. Here's just an extension of what you're already doing in your data warehouse. Now, I want to ask some questions as I want to make the emphasis on a build versus buy. The argument's been around as long as I've been in technology, which is since the late 1980s, and that's always been in IT as well as in software engineering, is whether or not to buy something or not. But I want to ask if you discounted being able to do those things yourself because you thought it would be too expensive. And I'd like you to ask that question again, and hopefully you're asking that as you go up front. And did you discount being able to do those things yourself because you thought you didn't have the necessary skills? And as I already mentioned, I think if you're building a data warehouse inside your organization, you already have those skills. Now, in English, this is a bit of a tongue twister, as we say, if you've heard that expression, commoditization of the modularization of software. And really all I mean is that as we modularize software, which anyone who's studied object-oriented development we understand what we mean by that. Then we take those modules of functionality and build products out of them. Some of you may have worked for companies or work for companies now that do this. And that's what the Lineage tools are. I'm again just making the argument that you look in your final analysis in your organization to reevaluate and go through cost and skills and time to market and things to make sure you're not doing this just because that's what everyone else is doing. All right, I'm going to dive real deep, and we're going to look at a lot of entity relationship diagrams. Again, I'll try to kind of go slowly through these, but also we're going to get to the end so we can open up for some questions about implementation. Keep in mind, again, this is a particular type of implementation, and I'm going to try to emphasize what highlight what the important parts are that you would do in your own data warehouse, regardless of how you implement it. This does assume that your integration layer or your data warehouse is highly normalized, or if you've heard the term hyper normalized. If there are a lot of data vault folk out there, then you already know what a normalized structure looks like because that's what your technique does. Anchor modeling is the same. Or if you simply following relational design patterns, which is what you're looking at here. And this is a different implementation technique, but it's highly normalized. That is important because you need an independence of the temporality of each attribute. As an attribute changes, you want to know who did it, where it came from, etc. So it's important that that be normalized out in order to join to your lineage data. Now, the concepts here are, since they're all shown in a very normalized relational form, the lineage data can still be carried through to dimensional structures or flattened structures used at the point of business user consumption of the data. The concept also assumes full automation of all of your data integration or ETL processes. Does not assume any particular database platform or a data integration tool set. And I am, in this presentation, I'm not going to show you anything on Oracle or Snowflake or SQL Server. It's all going to be very generic. I don't want to confuse any particular database implementations with what I'm talking about today. So this is all going to be very generic. All right, so let's get right to a particular what we mean by column and row from the title. And also with provenance at the column and row, if you hear that phrase, I mean showing the lineage of both the column and row, and imagining in this particular example, customer records with more than one originating source. So let's say, for example, one comes here from the CRM and is populating or updating our record, and another one is coming from an external app. And we want to be able to know where data came from, who changed it, which application, etc. And now I forgot about this. I put in, now what if we have two CRMs? The reason I gave this example, I've had this in the real world example. It was not Coca-Cola. It was another company where we had to have two CRMs live at the same time. And I won't go into detail explaining, but I know all of you have come across very bizarre requirements in your work history. This was one for me, having and there was a valid reason, and it lasted for about 6 months. So imagine where you have an external app where a customer can update certain attributes. Your original records come from your internal CRM, but then you're slowly migrating over to your new cloud CRM, and you have to track all of that data coming into your data warehouse. Okay, we move over. Give me just a moment while we move over to another slide. Okay. Now, if you're familiar with record source, I think, and Christian, correct me if I'm wrong, I think that's what it's called in Data Vault's technique of
Yes.
modeling. Okay, so if you're familiar with the record source column, that's where I'm going to start out so that it's a little familiar. So we have a customer record like we were looking at earlier, and we'll have a column there that tells us the source system from which that came. And what I'm going to do is remove that column and replace it with a foreign key column, execution ID, and we're going to look at the table that's referencing. Every table in your data warehouse is going to have this execution ID or some column, some foreign key column that's going to point to a record in some table. In this particular case, I'm calling it auditing.execution. This is a record of a data integration processing event or an ETL processing event, or if you want to use modern terminology, people call them data pipelines now. So if this is a record of the execution of one of your pipelines, it's going to hold a row for every execution of that process. Each row is a unique composite of a task, the object that performed the task, the time that the task was executed, and the task that executed this task if that is different. If it's the parent, then execution and parent would simply be the same value. Now, there are supporting schemas to this because since it is highly normalized, there are a lot of tables involved. I'm going to try not to get too involved in that because I don't want to confuse things. I'm going to just stick to the kind of the primary entities that we want to talk about. And also, again, this is just a suggestion. You might implement this a little differently. So I just want to put the idea of changing that record source into a foreign key column that references another set of tables that's going to contain all of your lineage and provenance information. And you can design that however you want. The point I want to make clear is that you can extend the model from the integration process execution and to support your particular requirements. And remember that our relational model from earlier, each of those attributes being normalized into their own tables. Here you can see some of the supporting tables. There's I think telecom place, geography name. You see them across the bottom of the screen there. Those are some business data tables, and they all contain execution ID, which relates back to the parent record in the execution table. And again, it's just a record, kind of an audit of showing that you've had an ETL or data pipeline execute. And we're going to drill down a little further. Now, notice that lineage table. We're going to look a little more closely at that. That's related in a one-to-many relationship for each execution. There can be one or more records of a lineage, and we're going to talk now about what that is. Let's look a little more closely. Each row for each attribute written to an individual execution of a process. This implemented here is execution ID and destination object ID. What that means is that the uniqueness of a row in this table is the destination table and column. This reason we say both column and row. So it's down to the individual column in one of your business data tables. And then the execution of the process that populated. So that composite is going to be your primary key for that. The source object you see is that's going to represent the table and or column or file, by the way, since a lot of our data comes from source files externally, maybe a JSON file or XML file. That source object ID can be anything. Well, I promised that we wouldn't get confusing, and now it suddenly looks confusing. But the point of this slide is simply to show that from that in the center, that record of an execution is relating to every table that's going to contain business data. And then from that, you can relate to a record of the lineage for each particular table and column. And as the process continues to execute each business attribute that is written to a new row in that table, the data integration process subsequently writes a row to the auditing lineage table, and that records the entire lineage of a source file or table, plus the individual data attributes from their source to the destination. This next slide is kind of a common way that we use to describe data warehousing landscapes. I don't see this type of diagram much anymore, but they're still out there where you show your source systems or files, whatever that may be, and your ETL processes, and then on to a data warehouse. In this case, I'm showing the additional staging layer that a lot of folks use. And I wanted to talk through that this particular implementation, and if you do this yourself and design it a little differently, you might want to pay attention to this aspect of your pipelines, which is that a particular column in a particular business table may have been persisted more than once in your ETL process. Hopefully not more than staging, but you would be able to record that. And I'm going to actually show an example where you can see that, and it'll make a little more sense, hopefully. So in this example, if you want to write, see if a staging table where your first extract from its source, then write to that staging table, then read data from the staging table, transform it, and then write it to its ultimate destination. This is the structure that will also support that activity as well as. Okay, let's move on. All right, since the lineage record is related to a row in the execution table, and that table's primary key is a foreign key in every business table, as we've mentioned, we can create data sets by joining these tables together. So we see an original in this example, an original CRM record of a customer. And then we're going to have, when that gets written or read and the ETL process executes, we're going to have an execution record. And in this particular case, there are 3 different lineage records. And we'll see that it went from the source file, the DNB file, which we were importing, and went into a staging table. And then in the second row, let me get my laser pointer here so everyone knows what I'm talking about. So now we're in the second record down here where we're going to move it from staging over into the normalized table in its final destination. And then we see since that as a foreign key value, also wrote the control into this table that holds those textual values, the institution name value. Let's move away from that one. I think I'm going to go on to an example of where we join these together. Yeah, let's do that. Give me just a moment and I'll switch over to a data set that I want to show. Here we go. Now this is really wide. Now I've joined those 3 tables together. In this example, I've taken the order detail, and this item ID is supposed to be the product ID, and the unit of measure ID is a foreign key value to represent things like each and box and quart and the different types of units of measure. The valid time, and there's also a system time that's hidden from this view. It tells whether the record is active or current, and then we see the system time. Then we move on and we see join to that table in our results set, the auditing execution record that we've mentioned, and we see all the values there. Remember I said that what was unique about it was the object, the task, and the time. So we see all those values kind of denormalized out here so we can read them. And we had this process, a data pipeline we called the account loader, or I'm sorry, we called it load DMAS customer, and the object is the account loader. Now the third table that we've joined to, this auditing.lineage, all 3 of these, by the way, joined on execution ID. And now we see our source and destination objects. And remember when I talked about multi-hop? So let's look at these one by one. Notice let me turn my laser pointer on again here. I can find it. All right. From DMAS open orders, notice we go to a staging table. And then from that same staging table in our second row, we're taking one particular column, transforming that over to the normalized table in our data warehouse. And then from the same lineage or same execution, we have another lineage record that's going to populate the unit of measure table with the UOM value. And then later, that's actually duplicated, but then you see taking the ID, the surrogate key value, and populating the order detail with that. Since the order detail record didn't actually contain the each or the box or the whatever the value, it's just containing a foreign key value. So this lineage is actually showing us all of the population and movement of the foreign key values within the relational system. Then the pink, the reason I made this a little different color to stand out is, let me scroll back over to show this is the same order, but notice in the order detail record, one thing that's changed is this count. It went from 5 to 10. Everything else remained the same. Let's scroll and see what's different. We see that this did not come from the CRM. This came from an external application, and the task named here, load client customer, for the purposes of this example, the app's name, simply customer app. And let's look at the lineage for the app. So we have the source is the app, that populated a staging table, and then from the staging table, we populated the table in the data warehouse. And then here's an example of another particular column that was updated. And notice there are no other columns because that was the only one that changed. Okay, let me regroup. Now, I ran through all of those slides really quickly, Christian. I will back up to some of them. I did that on purpose because I wanted to give a little more time for Q&A if possible, and people have questions about implementations. I will give you a little background on where this came from. First of all, just the database design is an implementation technique. That's not really the purpose of this presentation. That's the reason I tried to give some references where I knew that might be similar in Data Vault or other techniques. That's an important piece. Having a record for each destination column in your data warehouse is part of this, regardless of how you implement it. For me, having this in a relational database, I've never done this in a new cloud database like Snowflake or anything. You may have some questions about that. I think you could probably implement this with that. The only difference is you don't have any declarative referential integrity, but I think you could implement it just fine, probably in Snowflake, because Christian, I think I've heard people are doing Data Vault in Snowflake, correct, and Redshift and other cloud databases. So I believe
They
they
do,
could
yes.
implement, you know. So let me pause there and stop and see if there are any immediate questions. I know I'll go really fast through all of those, but I'll go back also if you want me to show anything again or further explain in further detail anything.
Thanks a lot, Jay. We have a first question in the chat where Florian asks, how do you construct these pairs? Is it based on static or dynamic code analysis?
Which code are we talking about?
Florian, can you elaborate?
Yes, so I'm wondering, I'm talking about the code that executes the pipeline, right? Or the other way around, the code that the pipeline is executing, because I'm picturing some sort of SQL or ETL code that the pipeline is executing that's transforming this data. So how or from where do you extract the source and target column pairs?
Well, how you do your ETL, that's not really what this is about. You would have stored procedures that would populate these tables, and then you would add that to your existing ETL process. I don't think that particularly answered your question. I'm still not clear on what you mean by static or dynamic code analysis. I'm not.
So here I was thinking about, let's say if your ETL is a stored procedure that's transforming from staging to the target table, then I'm imagining you would look at this stored procedure and extract the information from there about what are the source columns and which target column are they mapping to.
Yes. Okay. There's a lot more you can do. This implementation also and I left this out because I didn't want to get too complicated, but there are some other tables that kind of mirror this. They're configuration tables, and so yes, the ETL process calls a stored procedure that says what are my expectations here? What is my source and destination? And then that's driven by a default template that you can then change. So what you would see if we're looking at the SQL and stored procedure, what you would see additional in addition to the SQL that you already have that's moving that data, you would simply see a call to a store procedure that populates these tables, and you would pass parameters such as the object ID and the execution ID and so on. And you would, for instance, in this particular implementation, there's a procedure called auditing.execution create or insert or initialize or something that returns the execution ID. That way you have the execution ID as a variable for when you call the store procedure to populate the lineage. So then for every time a table gets written to, a store procedure is called to populate this lineage table. And it carries that same auditing.execution ID until you have a new one, and then you simply change that variable. But the execution ID, like I said earlier, that represents the execution of a particular process. So that would exist throughout a particular ETL process. That wouldn't change. The only difference is you might pass in a parent execution ID so that you could see, for example, if you're populating a customer table, but there are a lot of related attributes, you might have a parent, let's say you're using integration services or Oracle Data Integrator or some tool where you can have parent objects that then subsequently execute other data flow tasks. And let's say our parent is for our customer table, but we're populating multiple tables in our data warehouse. And so I have multiple executions all related to that parent execution of the customer record.
Yeah, I see. Yeah,
so,
thanks. Because yeah,
okay.
I know you said you weren't going to talk about actual implementations, right? But that part is particularly interesting to me because when I've tried to do this before based on just looking at SQL code, essentially, I found it to be very difficult because if you just look at the SQL code, there are so many caveats and gotchas. You have to pay attention to a lot of things to get the source and the target exactly right. And whereas I think if you have a kind of a metadata-driven data warehouse where this is all written down in config somewhere, then I think you might run the risk of, well, if for whatever reason what's being executed in your warehouse doesn't match the configuration anymore. I know this shouldn't happen, but maybe in reality it does, right? Then your lineage is tracking what you're expecting to happen, rather than what's actually happening in reality, and you might be missing things. So,
right. That's why it's important. I mentioned those configuration tables, which I didn't show. That they're important but that's why in the execution, the actual execution of the process, you're recording where you actually read the data, not what's in a configuration table. That's for setup and to know where the system to data drive the process. Basically, is what that's for. It's not to be a default, because I see what you say. If you hard coded something and you had a data engineer come along and decide, well, this is a very similar data pipeline. I'm just going to copy that stored procedure. They could easily forget to change the input parameters or whatever, and then suddenly you have a problem there. So you have to make these calls. And by the way, even with this, there are probably other ways to implement it, and it depends on the ETL tool. I think the point, the thing I really want to make, I'll stop here, you want to walk away from, is that whatever your process is that is moving data is the process that's going to record all of this information. That's the important thing to remember, however you might choose to implement it. And this reminds me, for everyone, Christian will share my email or I'll share it. I would be happy, and this is not an advertisement for business, as long as it doesn't take up too much time. I would be happy to meet with anyone if you're serious about doing something, but you're not really sure how you want to implement it maybe a little differently in your environment because of what you're doing. I'd be happy to talk with you further beyond this presentation. Like I say, that's not we're not talking about business here. As long as it's not too long, I'd be glad to explain in a little further detail, because as has been said, there's a lot that kind of gets glossed over here. I'm just trying to make the high points.
Great, thank you.
We have another question from Anne where she asks, what happens if you have to merge data from two different systems in the data warehouse? How do you build data lineage then?
Let me go back to that. I'm going to bring this. All right, so the question is, let me go back and read her question exactly. All right, from two different systems. This example is an example like this. Originally, let me scroll over so you can see. Originally, the count of items ordered, this column right here in the last row at the bottom, that value was originally written up here, and it was written by an internal CRM, which if we scroll back over, we see it's the CRM account loader. But well, we can see right here the DMAS open orders. DMAS in this case, by the way, that happens to be the name of an old legacy system on AS400. That's what that stands for. So not to confuse anyone, this DMAS open orders is your original CRM or ERP system. So that's what wrote the record originally, and now this external application has come over. And if we look at the business data, scroll back, we see that what happened is that only one column got updated. So whoever was using the app just used it to change the number of units purchased from 5 to 10. Is that, I hope I answered that question. And did that, okay, good. All right, next we have every ETL job step, there's a config that can, all right, I think, Corel, I think I may have to get you to explain a little further on that question. For every ETL job step, there is a config that can log the run. Yes, that is what the execution table does. It's the date of the order.
Yeah,
I'm sorry. I'll finish up with Ann because I did miss that. I think there may be an incorrect date or something, but Ann, you're correct. That date would show. Oh, it does show. It does show. See, it went from October 11th at 11 to 12. It shows that update. I'm assuming that's what you're asking there, the date of the order. Oh, you're asking about order date. No, that's not showing here. So that would be the same. Okay, sorry. I'll go on to Corel now.
Yes, Jay. So that was when you were explaining the stored procedure that you call out to write this kind of data, and that stored procedure is driven by config. The config is specific to every step in the job step. So that's what I was confirming. My understanding is that what you're saying is, so for every job step that you program, you add config to say, in this job step, this is the source and the target that go with the job step. And depending on the actual rows you visit, you will write here.
Yes, we can imagine a store procedure example where you're selecting from one table and inserting into another. Let's imagine something very simple like selecting from staging, and I'm going to do let's use an example right here in front of us. I'm going to select from my staging order details the unit of measure values, and I'm going to do a select distinct or a select group by, so I get a unique list of units of measure. And then I've got some transformation rules that I can also store in related tables, which I don't have examples of that, but that's an implementation that could be done. You could have additional tables related to Lineage where you have, your config for that or your basic business rules. And then in this, the reason I mention that is because in this one, the units of measure from the source system could be misspelled. And so there are some transformation rules, and that could be stored in configuration as well as what to apply. So you take that distinct list in order to populate your unit of measure table, which is, of course, a foreign key to what we're dealing with here. It's just order detail. Did I cover that for you? Let me look at.
Can you just scroll a bit to the right again, I think?
Yes. Salting execution.
So this here, yeah, the object and the task that I assumed comes from config. So
yes, and let me speak about these a little more detail because I can see about what those means. Those names can be somewhat arbitrary. In this case, CRM.accountLoader is simply the name of an SSIS package, and load DMAS customer is the name of a data flow task. So let's see. I'm trying to think of some others. I can't remember the terminology in ODI, but in SAP Data Services, it's similar. It would be a data source name. So those of you familiar with different ETL tools, that's simply the name of the task. It could also be the name. It might be the name of a stored procedure. We've talked about stored procedures as examples where we select from a staging table and insert into our destinations. That might be the name there as well. Does that make sense, Carol, about what those names are?
Okay, I think let's leave it there. Let's take it offline.
Okay. I'll be happy to talk to you anytime. Let's read on. Anne. Okay, she was answered, and then
yeah, that's
another
interesting question from Marin. Marin asks, how would you display the lineage for a calculated field, for example, a KPI We're interested in which attributes from which tables were used in the calculation.
Yeah, I mentioned earlier you could have additional tables related to Lineage where they're holding some rules. That's the way I've done that in the past. And so in my view, for instance, on the business intelligence side, I'm going to write a query to pull for a report. I'm writing a query for the business data. I'm just going to join on the auditing execution in Lineage, or maybe just the Lineage table. And then from Lineage, I join on the table where I'm holding the calculation that was performed so that I can then display it for the user. And I've done, and the way that I implement this many, many years ago, but the way it was implemented, you might still do it today, which, and I believe this was a Tableau, where as the user move their cursor over an element of data. Let's take your example of a calculated field. Then you would get a tooltip. And what the tooltip was the other columns in the data set that populated the report. And it was all the lineage information. So the tooltip would pop up when you would mouse over, and it would actually show the calculation that was made to produce this, in addition to the source and the destination tables and columns and files and things of that nature.
Okay, so if I understood correctly, you want to add some additional auditing tables with that's again related to your execution ID, and of course it's going to be a bit more complex relation because of course now you can have not just one field that corresponds to a calculated field, but multiple. Or
yeah, so there might be multiple fields that containing lineage and provenance data. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, like I mean,
Yeah.
for me, like the challenging part to get is let's just do it on an example here. Like, let's say I have a row in this table. And let's say there's a field that's a KPI, and for this particular KPI, I used 3 attributes: one from one table, 2 from the other, and then it's kind of how do I encode this information here?
Yeah, the way that would happen is the store procedure that gets called from the ETL process to populate the table. It gets called additional times, right? You would call it for every column that you're using in the calculation. So if we were to display it here, if we would have our business data joined to the lineage data, we would see duplicates, right, in our view. We would see duplicates because let's say you had 3 columns from your source system involved in the calculation, or from the destination. It doesn't matter where they're from, but then that would duplicate your business record 3 times, right? And then you would if you did the same type of query, you would see it over here in the lineage data that you join to. Except there would be additional tables beyond lineage, right? You would see the source and destination table and columns, but you might see an additional, let's call it the calculation table or whatever, and you might have it as XML, or you might have it as free text, and so you can display that calculation in a tooltip is one example. So yeah, actually, this view might have a lot. You could, if you really got complex, this view might end up having a lot of left outer joins, which would not be, your performance would not be so great. So you might think of a different way to implement that. I try to use as many, I know in on RDBMS, I try to use as many materialized views as possible for performance, but this could be a performance issue. You have to be careful about how you implement it. In this particular case, I didn't go beyond source and destination. In the case of doing the tooltips, we used another store procedure call when the report would render, and that way we weren't bogging down the time of execution just to pull business data. So you would just want to be very smart about how you implement.
Yeah, I'm thinking now about it. It might even be you would want the primary key for that to be the object and task, your ETL process, like you were mentioning. That's actually where the information about the what you're using for the calculation lies.
Yes, your structure, your table structure could obviously your names can be different, whatever makes sense to you in your environment, but the actual implementation structure could be it could look very different, right? Your relationship might be very different. I think that the takeaway that I want to give to everyone is that don't just assume that you're going to want to go out and buy a product because you have the business coming to you, your organization's coming to you and saying, hey, we need to have this information presented to us in reporting, and that's a requirement presented to you. You don't automatically have to think, well, let's go out and buy a product. I know we've talked a little bit about the complicated nature of how this can become complicated, but once you develop your own framework, it really is copy and paste, and all of my code for this is automatically generated. If you're using any kind of dynamic generation for your data warehouse, you could incorporate that into that process, which is what I do. All of these tables and store procedures, they're automatically created if I were to start a new data warehouse from scratch, right? So once you get your process set up and tested and everything, then I think the argument that this is too complicated, I don't want to do it, it kind of loses value. Although I can see a situation if you're alone and you're working on a data warehouse within your organization, you're all by yourself or you're a small team, you may not have the resources. I still would ask you to think about this, because it may be that this is not as much work. Even though we do talk about there can be complications, you can run into problems if you get too complicated. Once you get that template down and you test it, it is pretty simple to look at and to implement, and even to think about as you go forward and you extend your data warehouse in the future. It's pretty easy to manage this. And again, as in terms of the business intelligence side of this, the only thing in most cases that we're doing is adding some joins to our views. Or we, again, as I said, in the one particular case where I added store procedure calls from the client separate, and that helped with performance. But that's a detail of how you implement it.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions?
And by the way, I'll say I want to say one more thing on that. I didn't do that. It was a business intelligence person that had the idea to do the tooltip. That's been my favorite through the years that I've seen. I've seen people try to put it into the report, like they'll add another column, like you see here, source and destination, or they'll create a link where you click on the business data is hyperlinked, and you click on it and it does a pop-up, or it goes to another page or whatever. That the one that's been the most user-friendly, and I suppose this is just my opinion, it's going to depend on you to determine what is most user-friendly for you. But for me, the most user-friendly one was where I would just take my mouse and tooltip over any business data field, and it would pop up the Lineage data. As long as it doesn't get too much, too big, then that's been my favorite implementation of it that I've seen.
No, it sounds really elegant and a nice user experience. Thank you.
Okay, we still have time for one more question. Anything else?
I'm going to, I don't want to interrupt anyone. Just interrupt me. I'm going to put my email address really quick if anyone does want to discuss this in some more detail. Feel free to reach out. Like I said, if it's not too time consuming, then we're not talking about any kind of business arrangement, just another colleague reaching out to have a conversation. I think it was a year ago that Christian, that you and I had the first conversation, and I was showing him examples of this. Almost a year ago, we were talking about it.
Okay, I guess then we will. Since there don't seem to be any more questions, we'll call it a day. Thank you again, Jay, for your presentation.
Thank you.
Glad we finally got to hear it.
Yes.
And see you all next time.
Thanks again, everyone. Bye-bye.